What if the very place built to protect justice became the stage of its cruelest betrayal? In a courtroom heavy with silence, a black woman stood, not as a criminal, but as a daughter, a mother, a citizen asking for fairness. With one swift motion, a bailiff's hand struck her down, and the gavel's echo turned into thunder in her soul. The world saw her fall, but no one saw the storm rising within her. Because beneath the pain, humiliation and fear, she carried a fire that could not be silenced. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the polished wood and rows of stiff-backed benches. It smelled faintly of dust and varnish, of old echoes trapped in the grain of the floorboards. Every creak of shoes, every cough from the gallery felt amplified by the cavernous space, as though the room itself demanded silence, demanded reverence. And in that silence, she stood. Her hands were folded tightly in front of her, fingers laced so hard her knuckles turned white. It wasn't fear that gripped her body. It was something deeper, heavier, like standing in the shadow of centuries of voices telling her to be quiet. She looked toward the bench where the judge's indifferent gaze bore down with the weight of law itself. She wasn't here to beg. She wasn't here to plead. She was here to speak, to demand what was right, though her voice already trembled before it ever reached her lips. The bailiff loomed to her right, his presence both official and menacing. He had that look, the kind of man who carried the badge not as a symbol of service, but as a weapon of control. His eyes darted at her with impatience, like she was taking up too much air, too much space in a room not built for her. She tried not to meet his gaze, but the tension crackled between them like static before a storm. When she spoke, her voice was fragile at first, breaking in the stillness. "Your Honor," she began, the words shaky, but beneath them was a river of determination. "I only want to be treated fairly." The words hadn't finished leaving her lips when it happened. The bailiff's hand, sudden and brutal, cut through the air with a sound sharp as a whip. His palm connected with her face, the force sending her stumbling sideways, her body crumpling to the polished floor with a thud that reverberated in the hollow silence. Gasps echoed across the gallery, scattered like sparks in the dark. For a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. Her cheek burned. Her ear rang. She pressed her palm to her face, fingers trembling, feeling the heat rising from her skin where his hand had struck. The courtroom's walls seemed to close in, every eye staring down at her not with compassion, but with morbid fascination. She wanted to scream, but her throat locked tight. She wanted to cry, but her pride forbade it. The humiliation burned deeper than the pain. The gavel cracked against wood, the judge calling for order as though the chaos belonged to her. The sound echoed like thunder, but it did not drown out the pounding of her heart, the roar in her head. Somewhere in that dizzying haze of pain and disbelief, she thought of her mother. Her mother's voice came back, not as a whisper, but as a shield. "No one can take your dignity, unless you let them. Remember who you are." She lifted her head, vision blurred with tears she would not allow to fall. Slowly, with a body that felt heavy as stone, she began to rise. Every muscle screamed, every nerve ached, but still she rose. The bailiff glared down at her, expecting her to stay broken on the floor, expecting silence. But she did not stay down. Her knees shook. Her breath came ragged, but she stood. The room was watching, the gallery hushed, the weight of centuries pressing against her spine. And yet, shut, they found the strength to meet their eyes. For a fleeting second, the judge's gavel hovered, but it was not the sound of authority that filled the air. It was her silence, powerful, unyielding, a silence that said, "I am not finished. You cannot erase me with your hand." And in that moment the seed was planted, not revenge, Not even rage. Something more enduring, a vow carved deep into her soul. One day I will stand higher than this bench. One day I will not bow to this injustice. One day I will not be the one struck down. I will be the one who stands. The bailiff shifted uneasily, as though he too had felt something shift, something that could not be undone. The gavel came down again, but its sound no longer mattered. The room had witnessed something more powerful than authority, more dangerous than silence. They had witnessed a woman humiliated but unbroken, a flame that had been struck but not extinguished. And deep inside, though her cheek still burned, though her body still trembled, she knew. The story was only beginning. The sting lingered long after the slap. It was not just on her cheek, but in the marrow of her bones, a heat that radiated outward, pulsing with humiliation and disbelief. She had been struck before, by life, by prejudice, by the quiet cruelties of a world that demanded her silence, but never like this, never in the very room where truth was supposed to reign. The gallery had grown restless. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting away, unwilling to witness the spectacle too closely, as though looking directly at her pain might implicate them. Others leaned forward, hungry for drama, waiting to see whether she would collapse into tears or lash out in anger. She gave them neither. Instead, she steadied herself. Her breath trembled, but she forced it to slow, in and out, like waves beating against a shore. She remembered for a moment her daughter's face, the way her little girl's hand had slipped into hers that morning, sticky from syrup, warm with innocence. "Good luck, Mama," she had said, smiling, unaware of the storm her mother was walking into. That memory became her anchor. "Order in the court!" The judge barked again, gavel cracking against wood. But the authority in his voice sounded hollow now, like a church bell in an abandoned town. Authority meant nothing when it failed to protect the vulnerable. The bailiff loomed over her still, his jaw set, eyes daring her to move wrong, to speak wrong, to exist wrong. He had the look of a man who had already convinced himself she deserved it, who would tell himself later that she had provoked it, that he had kept order, that violence was justified. Her cheek throbbed. The air felt thin, but when she lifted her head, her eyes locked on his, and for the briefest second, his gaze faltered. She saw it, a flicker of uncertainty, the tiniest crack in his mask of control. He had expected her to stay down, to cower. He hadn't expected her to rise. The judge cleared his throat, eyes flicking between them, uneasy. "Miss, please compose yourself," he said, his voice softer, almost dismissive, as though she were the one who had broken the sanctity of the courtroom. Her lips parted, words forming before she could stop them. "Compose myself?" Her voice was quiet but sharp, cutting through the silence. "I was struck to the ground in your court, and you ask me to compose myself?" The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Some in the gallery gasped again, while others looked away ashamed, as though her courage revealed their cowardice. The bailiff shifted, but his hands stayed clenched at his sides. The judge's gavel twitched in his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but she continued, voice trembling yet growing steadier with each syllable. "You call this justice? You let a man in uniform lay his hands on me, not because I threatened order, but because I dared to speak." She lifted her chin, pain flashing through her eyes, but defiance burning brighter. "If this is your order, then it is built on silence, and I will not be silent." The courtroom went still. Even the humming lights above seemed to quiet, as though listening. The judge finally slammed his gavel down, harder this time, his voice booming. "Enough! This court will not tolerate further outbursts." But it was too late. The room had already heard her. The words, once spoken, could not be unspoken. They echoed in the hearts of those who had never dared to say them aloud. They carved themselves into the air, into memory. Her knees weakened, but she refused to sit back down. She remained standing, shoulders squared, every nerve alight with fury and dignity. The bailiff glanced at the judge, awaiting instruction, his fists twitching at his sides. For a heartbeat, the tension was unbearable. Would he strike again? Would they drag her out? The judge exhaled heavily, adjusting his glasses, unwilling to look directly at her. "Bailiff, return to your post." His voice was gruff, almost reluctant. And just like that, the danger passed. But not the weight of what had been done. She sat slowly, her body rigid, her heart thundering. The courtroom continued, words echoing, cases argued, motions passed, but nothing felt the same. Not for her, not for anyone who had witnessed it. She touched her cheek again, still burning, still raw. But beneath the pain was something else now, something alive and dangerous. It was the seed that had been planted the moment she stood back up. The trial moved on, but she heard little of it. Her mind was already elsewhere, on her daughter, on her mother, on the endless line of women who had endured worse and still carried themselves with grace. She was part of them now. She carried their voices in her silence. And deep down, she made herself a promise. This moment will not break me. It will become the stone I step on to rise. Yet even as she made that vow, a cold thought crept in. The system would not let her rise without a fight. And when the gavel fell again, marking the day's end, she knew her battle had only just begun. When the final gavel fell, the courtroom exhaled as though it had been holding its breath all along. Papers shuffled, shoes scraped the polished floor, and conversations buzzed low, cautious, like people whispering in the wake of an accident. She sat unmoving, her hands folded once more, but the tremor in her fingers betrayed the storm inside her. The bailiff avoided her eyes now. He stood at his post, posture stiff, his earlier dominance dimmed to a shadow. She caught him once glancing her way, but quickly he looked off again, jaw tight. For a man so eager to assert his power, he suddenly seemed uneasy under her quiet gaze. That flicker of discomfort gave her the smallest, sharpest satisfaction. He had struck her, but he had not broken her. And somewhere he knew it. She waited until the courtroom emptied. One by one, the curious eyes and hushed whispers disappeared through the heavy wooden doors. She gathered her things with deliberate slowness, feeling every ache in her body, every pulse in her cheek. As she stood, she felt the eyes of the judge linger on her from the bench. He said nothing. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just silence. That silence told her everything she needed to know about the justice he claimed to serve. The doors groaned as she pushed them open, stepping into the hallway. The sound of her heels echoed off marble walls, hollow and sharp. Sunlight streamed faintly through high windows, but it felt cold against her skin, as if the building itself had no warmth to give. Reporters waited outside, a cluster of hungry faces with cameras ready. Flashes exploded the moment she emerged, blinding her, burning her humiliation into permanence. Questions flew at her like darts. Why were you struck? What did you say to provoke him? Will you press charges? None of teared. Hem asked how she felt. None asked how it broke something inside her. They only wanted the spectacle. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and kept walking, lips pressed into a thin line. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. Her silence was her shield. Outside, the air smelled of rain, heavy clouds rolling in as if the sky itself carried her unrest. Each step down the courthouse steps felt like a descent from one world into another, from the marble halls of supposed justice into the gritty streets where real life waited. She thought of her daughter again, waiting at home, her small arms ready to wrap around her. That thought steadied her knees, softened her breath. But as she reached the sidewalk, she froze. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, stood a figure watching her. A man in a dark coat, hat pulled low. He wasn't part of the press. He didn't hold a camera or a notebook. He simply watched. When their eyes met, he tilted his head slightly. Not unkind, but with a strange weight behind the gesture, as though he knew something she didn't yet know. And then, just as quickly, he disappeared into the crowd. She shook off the chill that crept through her spine. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was only her nerves frayed and raw. Still, the moment lingered as she walked, her footsteps quickening, her heart still heavy with the memory of the bailiff's hand. By the time she reached her apartment, the rain had begun to fall. Thin drops at first, then heavier, until the sky poured itself out like grief. She stood at the window, watching streaks of water race each other down the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, fractured by droplets. She lifted her fingers to her cheek again, tracing the tender skin, her eyes filling now in the safety of solitude. The tears came quietly. Not with sobs, not with wails, but with the quiet surrender of someone who had carried too much weight for too long. She let them fall, each one a release, each one a vow. Because tomorrow, she would not allow this to be the end. The rain hammered, harder, drowning the city in its rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, merging with thunder. The world felt chaotic, fragile, trembling at its edges, just as she did. Yet in that fragility, something else stirred. A fragile strength, like the first shoot of green pushing through broken concrete. She whispered into the dim room, her voice trembling but firm. "You will not define me. Not today. Not ever." And though the night pressed close around her, though her body still shook with pain and rage, she felt the faintest glimmer of something more. Not hope yet. Hope was too light, too distant. But resolve. A steel thread winding itself through her veins. Because if justice would not protect her, she would learn to protect herself. If the system would not give her a voice, she would find a way to build one loud enough to shake the walls that had tried to silence her. The storm outside raged, lightning splitting the sky in violent flashes, thunder shaking the very bones of the earth. She stood by the window, her silhouette outlined by every burst of light. A woman struck down but still standing. A woman broken open but burning within. And somewhere, deep in the roar of the storm, it felt as though the future had heard her vow. The chapter of silence had ended. The next one, the one of fire, was about to begin. The rain had not stopped by the time she returned home. It followed her like a shadow, a steady drumbeat against the thin roof of her apartment, as though the sky itself insisted on remembering what had happened that day. She set her keys on the chipped counter, the metallic clink echoing in the small space, and leaned against the door with her eyes closed. The silence was thick, pressing, broken only by the sound of water striking glass. Her daughter was asleep in the bedroom, small breaths steady, soft snores just barely audible through the thin way. "Ow." That sound was a lifeline, proof that innocence still existed somewhere, even as the world outside clawed at her with claws of humiliation and injustice. She peeled off her damp coat, her body stiff, her cheeks still swollen from the bailiff's strike. In the bathroom mirror, she caught her reflection, a bruise beginning to bloom, purple shadows creeping under her skin. She touched it gently, flinching at the pain, but it was the look in her own eyes that hurt most. She looked tired, not just from today, but from years of carrying burdens too heavy, of swallowing words she wanted to scream, of forcing dignity into every step when the world tried to strip it away. She leaned closer to the mirror, whispering as though her reflection could answer, "Why do I keep fighting?" The question lingered, heavy, unanswered, until a memory stirred. Her mother's voice, warm, firm, unbreakable, rose in the silence. It wasn't imagination. It was memory, alive and vivid, painting the air with comfort. Strength is not the absence of pain, child. Strength is walking through it without letting it swallow you. She closed her eyes, and suddenly, she was back in her childhood home. The smell of hair grease and lavender filled her senses, the scratchy couch fabric brushing her bare legs as she sat cross-legged, her mother behind her, braiding her hair. The tug of fingers, rhythmic and steady, had always soothed her. "You see, baby," her mother had said, fingers weaving strands with patience. "Storms will come. People will slap you with words, with silence, sometimes even with their hands. But storms pass. And you, my girl, you must never let them wash you away." She remembered the way her mother's hands had smelled of soap and onions from the kitchen, how her nails clicked softly as she worked. She remembered the way her mother's eyes held entire galaxies of strength, unshaken by poverty, by prejudice, by men who underestimated her. Those eyes had always told her, "You are more than they say you are." Now, standing in the dim bathroom, the Makey, Emery wrapped around her like a blanket. She pressed her palms against the sink, steadying herself. Her cheek ached, but her mother's words soothed the deeper wound, the one buried in her chest, where humiliation had tried to root itself. She turned off the bathroom light and slipped into her bedroom. Her daughter stirred, mumbling in her sleep, one small hand stretched out across the blanket. She sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a curl from the child's forehead, watching her chest rise and fall. A lump formed in her throat. This was why she kept fighting. For her. For the future that deserved more than bruises and silence. The storm outside deepened, thunder rolling low like the growl of some ancient beast. She pulled the blanket higher over her daughter's shoulder, then went to the living room, curling into the worn armchair. The room was small, walls cracked, but it was hers. It was sanctuary, even if fragile. She hugged her knees to her chest, listening to the rain, letting her mother's voice fill the emptiness. But doubt was a cunning guest. It slipped in through the cracks, whispering questions that gnawed at her peace. What if this is all you'll ever be? A woman struck down, ignored, forgotten. What if the fight isn't worth the scars? Her breath hitched, eyes burning. For a moment she believed the whispers. For a moment, the weight pressed so heavy she thought she might sink beneath it. And then, 3 sharp knocks rattled her door. Her heart lurched. At this hour, in this weather, no one ever came. She froze, listening. Another knock, louder, firmer, carrying with it an urgency that made her chest tighten. She rose slowly, every muscle tense, her hand hovering near the doorknob. The storm howled outside, wind rattling the thin window panes. Her daughter stirred again, murmuring in her sleep. She placed her hand on the door, pulse racing. Who could it be? And what did they want from her? Tonight of all nights? The door vibrated under another knock, this time slower, deliberate, each strike echoing through the small apartment like a warning. Her hand tightened on the knob, but hesitation rooted her to the spot. The storm outside seemed to lean closer, wind whistling through the cracks, rain lashing harder against the windows. She whispered to herself, almost inaudible, "Who are you?" As if the door might answer. Her daughter mumbled in the bedroom, and the sound snapped her into motion. Whoever stood outside was not just at her door. They were dangerously close to the fragile world she had built for her child. That thought gave her courage, though it was laced with fear. She opened the door just enough to see. A man stood there, soaked from the rain, coat clinging to his frame, water dripping from the brim of his hat. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, his face etched with lines of fatigue, his eyes sharp despite the weariness. He didn't speak right away. He simply removed his hat, nodding slightly, as though acknowledging something sacred about being allowed this close. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying a weight of familiarity. "But I couldn't stay away. I was in that courtroom today." Her breath caught. Instinct told her to slam the door shut. She had already been stared at, gawked at, consumed like a headline. She didn't want another stranger digging into her wounds. But there was something in his voice, something that didn't reek of pity or curiosity. It was recognition. She narrowed her eyes. "And who are you?" He cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "My name's Elijah Turner. I used to practice law years ago. Walked away from it when I realized how much of the system was built to break people like us." His words hung heavy, like stones pulled from the bottom of a river. Her grip loosened slightly on the doorframe. There was no arrogance in him, no sense of superiority, only a weary honesty. "Why are you here?" she asked, suspicion laced in her too, as he met her gaze, steady. "Because when that bailiff struck you, something broke in me too. I've seen injustice before. I've lived through it. But what I saw today—" He shook his head, rainwater dripping from his silvered hair. "It was more than violence. It was a warning. And I need you to know. You don't have to face this alone." Her chest tightened. The words were ones she didn't realize she needed until they landed. Alone. That had been the rhythm of her life, even surrounded by people. Alone in her battles, alone in her pain. And here stood a man, a stranger, but not a stranger, offering something different. But with his offer came fear. Trust was dangerous. Trust had been broken too many times before. She stepped back, motioning him inside before the storm swallowed them both. He entered quietly, his wet shoes squeaking against the old linoleum. The apartment seemed to shrink around his presence, the air thick with the scent of rain. She gestured toward the chair opposite her own, and he sat carefully, as though aware of the fragility of the space he was entering. For a while, silence reigned. The storm outside filled the void, a steady percussion against the glass. Finally, Elijah spoke, his hands clasped together, fingers knotted with unease. "You've been marked now," he said softly. Not just by his hand, but by the system. They'll watch you. They'll wait for you to stumble, to quiet down. They think today broke you. He leaned forward, eyes fierce. But I saw you stand back up, and that shook them more than anything else could. Her throat tightened, tears threatening but held back. She shook her head, whispering, "I didn't feel strong. I felt small. I felt like the ground swallowed me, like the whole world saw me fall." Elijah's voice deepened. "Strength isn't about not falling. It's about standing back up when every part of you is screaming. G to stay down." The words hit her like a strike of lightning, illuminating something inside her she had buried under shame. Her mother's voice joined his in her memory, a chorus of resilience echoing in her chest. But even with that flicker of comfort, fear gnawed at her edges. "And if I keep standing? What then? What if they come after me harder?" Elijah held her gaze, unwavering. "Then you'll need to learn how to fight them, not with fists, but with knowledge. With the very laws they twist against us. You think you're powerless, but I promise you, you are not." The storm outside roared, thunder shaking the window panes. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle into her bones. He wasn't offering her pity. He was offering her a path. And though she didn't yet know if she had the strength to take it, she knew one thing: the night would not leave her as it had found her. The apartment felt heavier with Elijah's words, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. She sat back in her chair, arms crossed, not as defense, but as a way to hold herself together. The storm outside softened to a steady drizzle, a rhythm like fingers tapping on glass, the world exhaling after its own violent outburst. Elijah's eyes studied her quietly, patient. He wasn't rushing her to answer, wasn't filling the silence with empty comfort. He simply waited, as though he knew the storm in her chest needed room to break, before the calm could settle. At last, she spoke. Her voice was low, shaky, but honest. All my life, I've been told to keep my head down, be respectable, be quiet, endure. Today I did all of that, and still, he struck me. Her throat tightened. What's left when silence doesn't protect you anymore? Elijah leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Then you stop being silent. You stop surviving their way and start fighting your way. The words should have felt reckless, dangerous. Instead, they felt like truth. They stung because they demanded something she wasn't sure she had to give. Yet even as fear clenched her chest, she felt her mother's presence hovering near, nodding silently in approval, as though whispering, "This is the road. This is the cost." Her gaze fell to her hands, calloused from years of work, trembling slightly now. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "I'm just me, a woman with a child. I'm no fighter, not like that." Elijah shook his head, his expression softening. "You're exactly the fighter they fear, because you have something they can't take. Truth. And truth, when it's sharpened, can cut deeper than any weapon." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to take those words and build a fortress out of them. But the bruise on her cheek reminded her of reality. Truth didn't always protect you from the hand that struck. Truth didn't always save you. She rose from her chair, pacing toward the window. The rain had slowed, but the street still glistened, reflecting the dim glow of street lamps. In the glass, her reflection stared back at her, weary, wounded, but alive. She traced her fingers over the cool pane, as if touching both the woman she was and the woman she feared she might never become. Behind her, Elijah's voice softened, almost reverent. "You remind me of your mother." The words froze her. She turned sharply. "You knew her?" He nodded slowly. "Years ago. We marched together once, back when we thought change was just a matter of shouting loud enough. She had a fire about her, quiet, but fierce. I never forgot it." Her chest ached, memories of her mother flooding back, braiding her hair, whispering wisdom, standing tall even when the world tried to bend her. Tears pricked her eyes, spilling before she could hold them back. She pressed her palms against her face, ashamed of her weakness, but Elijah's voice was steady. "Don't hide it. That's not weakness. That's proof you still care. And that's where strength begins." She lowered her hands, breath ragged, cheeks wet. "She told me storms would come. That dignity was the one thing they couldn't take." She laughed bitterly through the tears. "But it feels like he took that too." Elijah stood slowly, crossing the room until he was near but not too close. His voice was firm, unwavering. "No, he didn't. Because you stood back up. That's dignity. That's what no one can strip from you. Not a bailiff, not a judge, not a system built on silence. That's yours. And it's why you can't stop now." The words wrapped around her, not like a command, but like a lifeline. She breathed in deeply, letting them settle into the cracks where despair had been. For the first time that night, she felt not just broken, but rebuilding. She turned back to the window, staring at the faint glow of dawn breaking on the horizon. The storm had passed, but the street still glistened with its memory, the world transformed by its violence. Maybe she was like those streets, scarred, but reflecting light. Elijah moved toward the door, sensing the moment had reached its end. He placed his hat back on his head, pulling the brim low. "I won't stay tonight, but I'll be back, if you'll let me. There's work to be done, and you can't do it alone." She hesitated, then nodded. "Come back." He gave her a faint smile, the kind that carried both hope and warning. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow, we start turning that pain into something that can't be ignored." When the door closed behind him, the apartment was silent again. She stood in the middle of the room, the echo of his words mingling with her mother's memory. Her cheek still throbbed, her body still ached, but somewhere deep inside, something had shifted. She wasn't healed, not yet, but she wasn't powerless either. And as the first rays of light broke through the clouds, she whispered to herself, steady and certain, "I will not stay silent, not any more." The new day waited. And with it, the beginning of a fire she had yet to understand. The next morning dawned grey, the city still dripping from the storm. Puddles gleamed in the cracked sidewalks like scattered fragments of glass, and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and exhaust. She stood at the window with a cup of coffee cradled in her hands, the steam rising into her face, warming her cheek where the bruise had deepened overnight into shades of purple and blue. Her daughter stirred in the bedroom, yawning, rubbing sleepy eyes, and padding out in socks too big for her small feet. The child climbed into her lap without a word, resting her head against her chest. The weight of her daughter's body was grounding, an anchor against the flood of thoughts that hadn't let her sleep. She kissed the crown of the girl's head, inhaling the faint scent of cereal and shampoo, and whispered, "Mama's here." But in the silence that followed, she wondered, for how long? In what way? Because she knew now that life would not return to the way it had been. Something irreversible had begun in that courtroom, something that demanded more of her than she had ever thought she could give. A knock came at the door. Not sharp, not urgent this time, steady, measured. She didn't flinch. She knew who it was. Elijah entered with a stack of books under his arm, worn hardcovers with faded spines and sticky notes peeking out like flags of battle. He nodded at her daughter with a kind smile, then set the books on the table. "I brought you tools," he said. She raised an eyebrow, setting her cup down. "Tools?" "Knowledge," he replied simply, tapping the top book. "Law books, cases, histories. If you're going to fight them, you need to know their language. You need to master it until they can't use it against you." Her chest tightened at the sight of the books. They looked heavy, intimidating, more like walls than doors. She reached out hesitantly, running her fingers over the rough cover of one. The idea of studying, of entering the labyrinth of the law, felt impossible. She was no lawyer. She was just a woman who had been struck in a courtroom, who worked long hours to keep food on the table. Elijah seemed to read her hesitation. "I know it looks like a mountain, but every mountain is climbed one step at a time. You've already taken the first step by standing back up. The next is learning how to make them hear you." Her daughter tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, are those school books?" She smiled faintly, stroking her child's hair. "Something like that." The day stretched long, filled with the quiet turning of pages, the scratching of pencils, Elijah's voice guiding her through concepts that felt like foreign terrain. Words like precedent, appeal, constitutional rights echoed in her ears, overwhelming at first, but then, slowly, beginning to form patterns. She had always been quick to learn. Life had forced her to be. By evening, the living room was scattered with papers and sticky notes, her daughter colouring quietly in the corner while Elijah explained another case. The lamplight cast warm pools of gold on their faces, while outside the city flickered with neon signs and restless traffic. It was as though the world outside spun endlessly in chaos. But here, in this small room, something deliberate and steady was being built. Still, doubt gnawed at her. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Even if I learn this, what difference can one woman make against a system this big? Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a worn newspaper clipping from his pocket, unfolded it carefully, and slid it across the table. The headline read, "Young Lawyer Defies Court, Wins Landmark Case." That was me, Elijah said quietly. Decades ago, I was young, angry, ready to change the world. I won that case, but the system wore me down after. I let it. I walked away. His eyes locked with hers, sharp with conviction. But you remind me of the fight I lost. You can't walk away. Not now. Not after what happened. Her heart thudded painfully, as though the weight of his belief in her pressed against her chest. She looked at the books again, at the endless path they represented, and felt fear mingle with something more dangerous. Resolve. The night grew darker. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, and the city's heartbeat pulsed through the walls. She gathered the books into a stack, her hands steady this time. "Fine," she said softly. "Show me where to start." Elijah's eyes glimmered, relief hidden beneath his calm. "We start with fire," he said. "Theirs has always been in the shadows. Now we'll light our own." But neither of them noticed the shadow that lingered outside, just beyond the window, a silhouette watching, unmoving, as though the storm had not ended after all. Nights bled into days, and days bled back into nights. The rhythm of her life shifted, no longer defined by the small comforts of routine, but by the relentless hunger of study. Law books became the landscape of her home, stacked on the table, propped open on the couch, even carried to bed. Her daughter would sometimes climb into her lap, tugging at the heavy pages as though they were storybooks, asking, "Mama, what does this one say?" She would smile tiredly, brushing the child's curls back, and answer, "It says we deserve better." Elijah was patient, but stern. He pushed her, tested her, quizzed her, until her head spun. At first she resented him for it, for pressing her wounds when they were still tender, but beneath her frustration she knew why. He wasn't just teaching her the law, he was forging her into something unbreakable. Still, there were nights when doubt swarmed her like locusts, when the words blurred on the page and exhaustion left her trembling. She would close the book, bury her face in her hands, and whisper into the silence, "I can't do this." And every time Elijah would sit across from her, calm as stone, and say, "Yes, you can. Because you already are." The city outside seemed to echo her turmoil. Sirens became a lullaby. Police lights streaked across her walls at night, and rain seemed endless, dripping like the pulse of her fears. The world was restless, fractured, and she felt both part of it and apart from it. In the quiet hours, she thought often of her mother. She imagined her mother's approval, imagined her steady voice saying, "This is the fight you were born for." But the shadows pressed closer too. She noticed it first in small ways, strangers lingering too long outside her building, unfamiliar cars idling on her street. At first she told herself it was paranoia. the natural suspicion that comes when you step into dangerous waters. But then came the note. One evening, as she returned home from work, a folded slip of paper waited on her door. Her heart pounded as she opened it. The words were scrawled in jagged black ink. Stay in your place. Next time, it won't just be a slap. Her hands shook as she clutched the note, bile rising in her throat. She locked the door quickly, checking twice, 3 times. Her daughter hummed in the next room, playing with her toys, blissfully unaware. She forced herself to smile when the little girl ran into her arms, pressing a kiss to her daughter's head, to hide the trembling in her own body. When Elijah arrived later, she shoved the note across the table, anger blazing in her eyes. "They're watching me," she said, voice sharp. "They're trying to scare me back into silence." Elijah read the note, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he crumpled the paper in his hand and tossed it into the trash. "Good," he muttered. Her eyes widened. "Good? How can you say that?" "Because fear is proof you're making them nervous," he explained, voice steady, deliberate. "They don't waste threats on people who don't matter. You matter now. That's why they're afraid."
The words steadied her in ways she didn't expect. Fear still crawled in her veins, but it was joined by something else. Power. The knowledge that her voice, even cracked and trembling, had begun to rattle the walls they thought impenetrable. Later that night, after Elijah left, she sat at the table alone, the books open before her. The lamplight flickered, shadows stretching long across the room. She picked up her pen, hand steady, and underlined a passage that struck her like thunder. The law, once known, belongs to all people. It cannot be owned by the few. Her lips curved into a faint smile, bitter but determined. If they wanted her silent, then every word she studied was rebellion. Every page she turned was defiance. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the thin window panes. She closed the book, stood, and walked to the window. Across the street, half hidden in the shadows, a figure lingered again. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel his stare like a knife in the dark. Her pulse quickened, fear coiling in her gut. But instead of pulling the curtain shut, she held his gaze across the distance, her chin lifting in defiance. "Watch me," she thought. "See me. I will not vanish." The figure shifted, then slowly melted into the night. She exhaled, her body trembling, but her spirit unbroken. The fire inside her burned hotter, and she knew this was only the beginning of the war. The night stretched long, her eyes refusing rest. She sat with the law books open around her, their pages illuminated by a single lamp, the rest of the apartment swallowed in darkness. Her daughter slept soundly in the next room, but for her, sleep had become a luxury she no longer trusted. Too many shadows lingered now, too many questions. Each creak of the building made her head snap up, each flicker of the lamp made her heart skip. But she would not turn away from the words in front of her. The law was dense, tangled, a forest of language designed to confuse and intimidate. Yet the more she read, the more she saw its patterns. She discovered its contradictions, places where it promised fairness but concealed loopholes. She marked them with careful notes, her pen scratching furiously, her handwriting trailing off when anger rose like a tide in her chest. How many lives had been trapped in these contradictions? How many voices silenced because they couldn't decipher the maze? Around midnight, Elijah returned. He carried a bag of food, setting it quietly on the table. "You haven't eaten," he said, more statement than question. She didn't argue. Hunger had been replaced by something more consuming, the need to understand, to arm herself. He handed her a sandwich anyway, his eyes lingering on the deepening bruise on her cheek. He didn't mention it,
but the silence between them acknowledged it louder than words. They ate in quiet, the city outside restless with honking horns and the occasional burst of laughter drifting from late-night bars. Elijah finally spoke, his voice low. "You're learning faster than I expected." She shook her head, chewing slowly. "I feel like I'm drowning." He smiled faintly. "That means you're in deep water. But deep water is where the strongest swimmers are made." Her throat tightened at his words, because she knew he wasn't just talking about the law. He was talking about her life, her survival, her very existence in a world that wanted her silent. The hours passed with them bent over books, debating cases, tracing arguments. She found herself speaking with more certainty, her questions sharper, her frustration giving way to clarity. By dawn, the lamplight flickered out as sunlight crept through the blinds, pale and tentative. She closed the final book with a sigh, exhaustion heavy in her bones, but a strange exhilaration thrumming in her veins. She was beginning to see it now, not just the law, but the path it could carve, a way to turn the very system that had truck her into the weapon she would wield. But the fire drew attention. That evening, as she returned home from work with her daughter in tow, the danger announced itself. The window of her apartment was shattered, glass glittering like ice across the floor. Her daughter gasped, clinging to her leg, eyes wide with fear. The room looked ransacked, papers scattered, books tossed, a chair knocked over. But nothing was stolen. It wasn't robbery. It was a message. Her chest tightened as she pulled her daughter close, whispering reassurance she didn't feel. The child's small body trembled against hers, and for the first time since the bailiff's hand struck her, she felt truly afraid, not for herself, but for the little girl whose innocence was now under threat. When Elijah arrived minutes later, his expression darkened. He crouched by the broken glass, fingers brushing over it, jaw clenched. "They're escalating," he said grimly. Her voice shook with fury. "They want me scared. They want me to give up." Elijah stood, his eyes burning. "Then don't. Make them regret ever trying to silence you." She held her daughter tighter, tears stinging her eyes. "But what if they hurt her?" Elijah placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Then we make sure they never get the chance." His certainty steadied her, but the fear lingered. That night, she tucked her daughter into bed with trembling hands, whispering promises she prayed she could keep, promises of safety, of a future brighter than this storm. She sat by the child's bedside until sleep claimed her, then returned to the table where the books waited. The fire inside her raged hotter than ever, no longer fueled only by humiliation or pain, but by the primal instinct to protect. She traced her fingers over the spine of a book, whispering into the shadows, "You will not take this from me. Not my voice, not my child, not my future." The storm outside had calmed, but inside a tempest burned, and somewhere in the distance footsteps echoed. Whether real or imagined, she could not tell, but she knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The shadows had seen her rise, and they would not rest until they tried to strike her down again. What they didn't know was that each strike only sharpened her fire. Years rolled forward like a river, sometimes swift, sometimes slow, but always pushing her farther from who she had been the day she was struck to the ground. What began as nights of scattered notes and whispered doubts grew into years of grueling study, of exams taken under fluorescent lights that flickered like the nerves inside her. She worked by day, studied by night, and raised her daughter in the in-between hours. Sleep became a stranger, yet her resolve never broke. Her daughter grew alongside her journey. First steps became first words, and soon first questions about why Mama always had books stacked high on the kitchen table. "Because knowledge is armor," she would answer, smiling through her exhaustion, and the little girl would nod solemnly, as though she understood that her mother was not just reading but building something invisible, something that might one day protect them both. Still, shadows never vanished. The threats continued. Notes slipped under her door, phone calls that ended in silence. Sometimes she caught the feeling of eyes watching from alleys or across streets, yet she refused to move. To run would be to admit defeat. Instead, she let the fear harden into fuel, every threat a spark that kept her fire alive. The day finally came, when she stood before the bar examiners, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was stark, lined with long tables where other candidates sat hunched over their papers, pens scratching furiously. She stared at the first question, and for a moment her mind went blank. Panic clawed at her throat. Then she remembered the bailiff's hand, the sting that had started all of this. She remembered Elijah, Hate's steady voice, her mother's wisdom, her daughter's tiny hand holding hers. And suddenly, the words returned. She wrote with a fury that felt less like answering questions and more like carving her truth into stone. Hours passed, but when the test ended, she knew she had given it everything. Waiting for results was its own kind of torment. Each day stretched longer than the last. She tried to distract herself, walking her daughter to school, cooking meals, rereading cases. But anxiety lived under her skin, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Even Elijah, usually so composed, seemed restless, pacing the floor of her apartment whenever he visited. "You've done the work," he reminded her. "No one can take that from you." But she could only nod, unable to silence the voice inside her whispering, "What if?" Weeks later, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain, its seal unremarkable, yet her hands shook as if it contained her entire future. She sat at the table, her daughter bouncing excitedly beside her, Elijah watching from across the room. The paper tore slowly under her fingers, each rip echoing like thunder. She unfolded the letter, her eyes skimmed, searching desperately for one word. Pass. Her breath left her body in a rush, tears blurring her vision. Her daughter squealed, throwing tiny arms around her neck. Elijah's smile was faint but proud, his eyes shimmering with something deeper than relief. She had done it. Against every shadow, against every bruise, she had passed. But triumph did not erase the battle still raging inside. Because even as she celebrated, memories of that courtroom returned, sharp and unyielding. She could still feel the sting of the slap, still hear the silence that had followed. She had risen above it, yes, but part of her feared that Scar would always be louder than her victory. That fear followed her into her first courtroom as a licensed attorney. The walls looked the same, the benches filled with the same restless whispers. But now she stood not as a victim, not as a defendant, but as counsel. The title fit awkwardly at first, like borrowed clothing. Yet when she opened her mouth to speak, her voice carried differently. It was no longer trembling. It was steel. Still, beneath the steel lived doubt. Did the judges see her strength or her scars? Did the jury hear her arguments, or the echo of a woman once silenced? Every step forward seemed shadowed by that question. And then came the day she would face her greatest test yet. She was called to argue a case not unlike her own. A woman struck, silenced, dismissed. The parallels tightened her chest, reopening wounds she thought had healed. As she stood to deliver her opening statement, her hands shook, not from fear of failure, but from the weight of history repeating itself. The courtroom leaned in. Her lips parted, and the trial within her began. The courtroom buzzed with faint murmurs, papers rustling like dry leaves in the wind. She stood at the counsel's table, her notes spread before her, but her eyes were fixed on the woman at the center of the case. The woman's hands twisted nervously in her lap, her eyes swollen from too many nights of tears. She looked small, fragile, like someone who had been convinced too often that her pain didn't matter. The sight of her was like looking into a mirror, back to that day when she had been struck and left to stand alone. The memory rose unbidden, her cheek stinging again as though the bailiff's hand had just landed. For a moment her breath faltered. Doubt crept in, cold and sharp. What if I fail her? What if my scars speak louder than my voice? Elijah sat behind her in the gallery, his presence steady, a silent anchor. She didn't turn to look, but she felt him there, watching, waiting for her to rise. She thought of her daughter too, waiting at home, believing her mother could change the world. And somewhere deeper, she felt her mother's voice again. Strength is walking through pain, not avoiding it. She lifted her head, spine straightening, and stepped forward. "Your Honor," she began, her voice firm but steady, "this is not just a case about procedure. This is a case about dignity, about the right of every person to stand in this room without fear of violence or silence. My client came here for justice, not humiliation, and today she will be heard." The words left her lips like arrows, precise, impossible to recall. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. The opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably, and the gallery fell silent. She continued, her voice gaining momentum with each phrase, the rhythm of her conviction carrying her beyond her fear. But inside, the trial was not just in this room. It was in her. Every word she spoke battled against the voice that whispered she was still the woman who had once been struck down. Each phrase was an argument against the doubt coiled in her chest. She wasn't just defending her client. She was defending herself, her past, her worth. The opposing counsel rose, sharp and dismissive, his arguments laced with subtle condescension. He tried to paint her client as hysterical, exaggerating, unreliable. Each word he spoke was another echo of the voices that had tried to silence her once. Her fists clenched beneath the table, nails biting into her palms. She wanted to scream. Instead, she waited. When her turn came again, she rose slowly, deliberate. "My colleague would have you believe that pain can be exaggerated, that humiliation can be fabricated. But I ask you, have you ever been struck down and told to be silent? Have you ever felt your dignity stripped from you in a room built for justice? My client has, and I have. And I can assure you, there is no exaggeration in the sound of a body hitting the ground." A ripple passed through the room. Gasps, a cough, the creak of a bench as someone leaned forward. Her words hung heavy, undeniable. The judge shifted in his seat, trying to maintain neutrality, but his jaw had tightened. She sat down, her chest heaving, her pulse racing. She hadn't planned to reveal her own scar, to lay it bare before the court. But it had slipped out, raw and unfiltered. For a moment, she feared she had gone too far, revealed too much. Yet when she glanced at her client, the woman's eyes shimmered with something she hadn't seen before. Hope. That was enough. The trial continued. Arguments volleyed back and forth, but she no longer felt the weight of her doubt crushing her. She had spoken her truth, and it had not destroyed her. It had strengthened her. Still, as the hours dragged on and the case reached its close, a new fear settled in. The verdict was out of her hands now, resting with a judge and jury who might still be blind to the pain laid before them. She had fought with everything she had, but would it be enough? When the gavel struck to end the session, the air seemed to hold its breath. She gathered her papers with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her ears. Elijah's hand touched her shoulder briefly as she walked past him, a silent reminder. Win or lose, she had stood. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, threatening rain. She tilted her head upward, feeling the damp air against her skin, as though the heavens themselves were waiting for the verdict. And as she walked away from the courthouse, her phone buzzed in her hand. The call was from the clerk's office. The decision had come sooner than expected. Her hands shook as she answered the call, pressing the phone tight against her ear to muffle the roar of traffic outside the courthouse. The clerk's voice was brisk, impersonal, yet the words cut through her like lightning. The verdict was ready. She was to return immediately. Her heart thudded painfully. Verdicts weren't supposed to come this quickly. That could mean certainty or dismissal. She slipped the phone back into her bag, inhaled sharply, and walked back inside, every step echoing in, the marble hallway like a drumbeat of fate. Elijah was waiting for her near the entrance, his face calm, but his eyes searching hers. "It's time?" he asked. She nodded, unable to find words. Together, they walked back into the courtroom, where her client sat stiffly on the bench, hands clasped in silent prayer. The air in the room was thick, every cough and shuffle swallowed by the tension. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder, as if the building itself understood the weight of the moment. The judge entered, robes trailing, expression unreadable. Everyone rose, then sat, the sound of the benches slamming back into place echoing like thunder. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles pale, her pulse a steady roar in her ears. The clerk read the decision, the words unfolding slowly, deliberately, like drops of water in a desert. "In the matter of—" Each syllable was agony. She watched her client's lips move in silent prayer, her shoulders trembling. She felt Elijah's presence behind her, steady as a mountain, but it was not enough to stop the storm inside her chest. Finally, the words came. The court found in favor of her client. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then a sharp inhale from the gallery, a soft sob from her client, and the faint creak of someone shifting in disbelief. She closed her eyes, the words sinking in like rain after drought. They had won. Her client collapsed into tears, clutching her hand. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice breaking. "You believed me. No one else ever has." She squeezed back, her throat too tight to speak. The victory was hers, but it was also her mother's, her daughter's, Elijah's, everyone who had carried her to this moment. Still, beneath the relief, something darker stirred, because even in victory, she knew the fight was far from over. Today, they had won a case, but the system was still what? It was vast, merciless, designed to break more than it built. After the judge dismissed them, she stepped outside into the heavy afternoon air. The clouds had finally broken, rain falling in slow, steady sheets. She tilted her face upward, letting the drops wash over her, mingling with the tears she refused to hide this time. Elijah joined her, holding an umbrella he didn't bother to open. He stood beside her in the rain, his silence carrying more weight than any words could. At last he spoke. "You see it now, don't you?" She turned to him, water streaking down her face. "See what?" "That your fight isn't just for you. It never was. It's for everyone who never got their verdict. Everyone who stayed silent because they thought no one would listen." He paused, his eyes piercing. "And now, they will listen to you." Her chest tightened, the truth of his words settling into her bones. She thought again of her mother's voice, of the slap that had started it all, of the vow she had whispered in the dark. "One day, I will stand higher than the bench that failed me." That day still felt impossibly far away, but for the first time, she believed it could come. The rain fell harder, soaking through her clothes, plastering her hair against her face, but she didn't move. She stood there, letting the storm wash her clean, letting it baptize her in its fury. Because she understood now that the trial within her was never about passing an exam or winning a case. It was about believing that her voice mattered, that her scars did not define her. They strengthened her. As thunder rolled across the sky, she whispered into the storm, a vow spoken not in fear, but in fire. This isn't the end. It's only the beginning. And somewhere deep in her chest, she felt her mother's spirit answer, "Rise." The courthouse loomed before her like a cathedral, its pillars rising against the morning sky, marble glowing pale in the early light. Years ago she had walked these same steps trembling, her cheeks stinging from the bailiff's hand. That day she had entered as a victim. Today she entered as something else. Her robes felt heavy on her shoulders, not as a burden but as a mantle. The fabric whispered with every step, trailing behind her like the shadows of her past. Each sound of her heels against the stone echoed in her chest, steady, deliberate, defiant. The city's noise faded into the background. The world seemed to bow to the silence she carried with her. Inside, the building smelled the same: polished wood, paper, dust, the faint tang of old water pipes. But the air was different now. Where once she felt eyes burn into her with contempt, today she felt them widen with awe. Clerks paused mid-step, their whispers buzzing like bees in her wake. Lawyers glanced up from their files, surprise flickering across their faces before giving way to uneasy respect. And then she saw him. The bailiff, older now, grey touching his hair, but still broad-shouldered, still stern. He stood rigid by the door of the courtroom, his eyes locking on hers. For a moment the years collapsed, and she felt again the sting of his palm, the humiliation of the floor beneath her. But this time she did not look away. Their eyes held, silence stretching taut between them. His jaw tightened, his throat bobbing as though words hovered there but refused to come. She walked past him, chin lifted, her presence towering not in height, but in power. The doors to the courtroom opened, and she stepped inside. The room was full. Citizens packed into the benches, their voices hushed, their eyes eager. Some knew her story, others only knew whispers. But all had come to see the impossible. The woman who had once been silenced, now seated at the bench where silence had been enforced. She approached the dais slowly, her hands brushing the polished wood as she ascended. Each step felt like a lifetime, as though she were walking not only for herself, but for every voice ever struck down, for every woman told to bow, for every dream denied its chance to rise. At the top she turned. The courtroom stretched out before her, faces blurred in the sea of anticipation. Her heart pounded, but her voice was steady as she addressed them. "This court is now in session." The gavel struck. The sound reverberated through the room, sharp and commanding, yet also different. Less a hammer of authority, more a declaration of change. The silence that followed was unlike the silence years ago. It was not oppressive. It was reverent. She studied the faces before her, defendants weary with fear, families clutching one another, citizens who had come seeking not just rulings, but justice. For the first time, she understood the weight of the bench, not as a throne of power, but as a seat of responsibility. Her gaze fell briefly to the gallery, where Elijah sat near the back. His hair was whiter now, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes glimmered with the same fire that had once carried her through the darkest nights. He nodded once, slow and proud. Then her eyes shifted to another row, where her daughter sat, no longer a child but a young woman, her head held high, her smile radiant. Pride shimmered in her daughter's eyes. Pride and something more. Belief. Her throat tightened, but she did not falter. She raised the gavel again, and as the wood met wood, the sound echoed differently this time. It was not the sound of order imposed. It was the sound of justice reborn. And yet, even as the room absorbed her presence, a question lingered like a ghost in the rafters. Would the system allow her to change it, or would it rise against her once more? The weight of the gavel still tingled in her hand as the first case was called. A young man, no older than 20, shuffled nervously to the front, shackles clinking faintly around his ankles. His eyes darted around the room, wide and frightened, as though he expected the world to crush him before he spoke. A single word. She recognized that look. It was the same look she had worn once, standing before a bench that seemed like a mountain, waiting for a verdict that might erase her. "State your name," she said, her voice calm, steady. The young man's lips trembled. David. She glanced at the papers before her, the details of his charge written in black ink. Theft. A broken life painted in legal jargon, stripped of context, stripped of humanity. She lifted her gaze back to him. "David, do you understand why you're here?" He swallowed hard, nodded. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Yes, ma'am." Her heart clenched. She could almost hear the echoes of past judges who would have dismissed him, scolded him, sentenced him without looking into his eyes. She would not do the same. "Tell me," she said softly, leaning forward just enough that her voice felt less like thunder and more like shelter. "What brought you here?" For a moment he blinked, confused. No one had asked him that before. Not in this way. Not with sincerity. His story spilled out haltingly. A mother working double shifts, an empty fridge, a hunger too loud to ignore. He stole not out of malice but desperation. His words trembled, yet they rang with a truth she knew too well. Poverty was not a crime, yet here he was, criminalized for it. The gallery shifted uneasily, murmurs rising. She tapped the gavel once. The sound silenced them, but her eyes remained fixed on David. "This court is not blind," she said firmly. "It sees the circumstances that lead to choices. Justice is not only punishment. It is understanding. It is balance. It is mercy, where mercy is due." Gasps rippled through the room. A judge speaking of mercy? Of humanity? For some it was unthinkable. For others, it was the answer they had been waiting to hear their whole lives. She sentenced him not to prison, but to a rehabilitation program, with support for his education and employment. David's eyes filled with tears, his body sagging with relief, as though for the first time he had been seen, not as a criminal, but as a human being. The gavel struck again, sealing the decision. Elijah leaned back in the gallery, his lips curving into a faint smile. Her daughter clasped her hands in her lap, her eyes shining. But not everyone shared their joy. In the shadows of the courtroom, men in suits whispered to one another, their expressions sharp with disapproval. Power does not like disruption, and she was disrupting everything. She felt their eyes on her as the next case began. She knew they would not sit quietly while she unraveled the threads of their system. They would plot, they would resist, they would find ways to strike back. But fear no longer ruled her. She had faced worse than whispers. She had faced humiliation in this very room, and she had risen from it. The day wore on, case after case, each one another chance to carve justice into the stone walls that had once silenced her. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions no one expected. She treated defendants not as numbers, but as lives. Some left the courtroom free, others with sentences fair but firm, yet each one left knowing they had been heard. And with each strike of her gavel, the room itself seemed to change. The walls no longer echoed with cold indifference. They resonated with something new. Dignity. As the final case closed and the courtroom emptied, she remained at the bench, alone. The silence settled around her, no longer heavy but sacred. She ran her fingers over the polished wood, remembering the first time she had touched it, trembling and broken. Now, her touch was steady. But even as she sat there, bathed in the fading light of the setting sun, she knew this was not the end of her journey. It was only the beginning of a greater battle. Because outside these walls, forces stirred, and they would not let her rise without a fight. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "Let them come. I am ready." The courthouse stood empty, its echoing corridors darkening with the approach of night. She lingered in the judge's chambers, the robe folded neatly over a chair, her hands resting on the desk that now bore her nameplate. The silence was profound, but it was not the silence of oppression she once knew. It was the silence before a storm, the kind that holds its breath, waiting to see what will come. Her daughter entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. She set one on the desk, smiling softly. "You looked powerful today, Mama," she said, her voice filled with awe. The words tightened her chest. She reached across the desk, taking her daughter's hand in both of hers. "I wasn't powerful," she said gently. "I was just true. That's all I ever wanted. To be true. Even when they told me not to be." Her daughter tilted her head, studying her with eyes so much like her own. "Is that what makes you a judge?" She paused, considering. Then she shook her head. "No. It's what makes me human. Being a judge just means I get to use it where it matters." The young woman smiled, but her eyes shone with tears. "Grandma would be proud." The mention of her mother's name was like a lantern in the room. She closed her eyes, imagining the steady hands braiding her hair, the firm voice that never broke. She whispered into the dim light, "I hope I've made you proud." The gavel still sat on the desk, heavy and cold. She lifted it slowly, weighing it in her hand. Once, its sound had marked her humiliation. Now, it marked her rebirth. She struck it gently against the block, the sound sharp in the silence. It echoed like thunder. It echoed like a promise. But as the sound faded, new noises crept in, the low murmur of voices outside, the shuffle of footsteps lingering where no one should be at this hour. Her daughter stiffened, glancing toward the door. "Mama?" She placed the gavel down, rising from her chair. "Stay here." She opened the chamber door to find Elijah waiting in the hallway, his expression grave. He leaned heavily on his cane, his face shadowed with concern. "They're already talking," he said. "Whispers in the corridors. They don't like what you did today." She nodded, unsurprised. "I expected that." Elijah's eyes softened, pride and worry mingling. "You've changed the rhythm of this place. People will never forget it. But be ready. They will test you, harder than you can imagine." She stepped closer, resting a hand briefly on his arm. "Then let them test me. I've been tested all my life. The difference is now, I have the bench, and I intend to use it." His lips curved into the faintest smile, but his eyes glimmered with unspoken fears. He glanced toward her daughter, who stood just behind her, determined and unafraid. Elijah nodded once, as though reassured by the sight. "Then I'll be here, as long as I can." When the hall fell quiet again, she returned to the chambers. She stood by the window, looking out at the city bathed in streetlights, alive with noise and movement. Somewhere out there, injustice still reigned. Somewhere, another woman sat humiliated. Another child went hungry. Another voice was silenced. But not here. Not anymore. She placed her hand against the glass, her reflection staring back at her. The bruise from years ago was gone, but the memory remained etched into her bones. And that memory was no longer her wound. It was her weapon. She turned back to the bench one last time, the wood gleaming in the dim light. She climbed the steps slowly, deliberately, and sat. For a moment she simply breathed, feeling the weight of it all, the years of struggle, the nights of doubt, the shadows that had threatened her. Then she raised the gavel. It struck like thunder, a sound that rolled through the chamber, through the halls, through her very soul, and into. Had sound was everything. The slap that had once dropped her to the floor, the vow whispered in her tears, the fire built in shadows, the trial within, and the triumph now realized. The courtroom had collapsed once in shock when she was struck down. Tonight it collapsed again, in awe, in reverence, in the undeniable truth that she had risen higher than anyone ever expected. She whispered, her voice steady and sure, carrying to no one and to everyone. I was silenced once. Never again. And with that, she set down the gavel, her journey complete, her rebirth sealed. The storm had ended, but its echoes would live forever.